Okay, now we actually get to talk about my proper theory of fascism. We've hit the theoretical underpinnings, I think, for the most part. So, an answer, if you haven't watched the prior video, go ahead and check that out if you'd like. You don't necessarily need it, but it's the other video where I explain what concerns I'm responding to with this theory of fascism, like what it isn't, and why I differ from prevailing theories of fascism. Why I feel the need to develop my own theory. And one thing to note as we go into this is my theory of fascism is best on the theoretical level in terms of it's not necessarily going to be the strongest diagnostically. So it's not necessarily going to be the most helpful. Like it's not designed to like help you look at an ideology and be like, this is or is not fascist. That's not like the goal of it. It's not an identification or a diagnostic theory of fascism. It's more of a theoretical or like the theoretical underpinnings of fascism or an attempt to describe what's happening in fascism. So, as I mentioned in the last video, fascism comes out in a very specific historical time. Like we have very intense processes of scientific racism, eugenics, industrialization, and colonialism. All of these things are reaching a feverish pitch in the early 1900s. So that's really what my theory of fascism comes down to, is the intensification of these processes in a specific form, which is that what fascism is self-colonization. One could even call it self-cannibalism. But it's basically the process of applying colonial-style rule to the homeland. Because in colonialism, what you have in the colonies, how colonial rule tends to work, is you have the colonizer population and the colonized population, and colonial rule is mostly is attempting to manage these two very different, usually hostile populations with a strong bias towards the colonizing population. So typically what we see is, like some of the common features are, in terms of governance, colonial governments will give massive deference and attempt to imitate the colonizing, the homeland's government styles. Edicts coming out from the homeland receive a lot more priority. People who are from the homeland often have privilege over people who are not, even if they're the same race. This was especially visible in Spanish Empire, for instance, where peninsulares, people from Spain itself, would have privilege over criollos, or people who were fully of Spanish descent but were born in the colonies. So basically, like colonialism often operates on a model of absolute homeland superiority. It's the model for everything. It's where all ideology and policy ultimately comes from, and you get judges or governors or whatnot whose entire approach to the matter is just imitating what the homeland does, and applying very legalistic frameworks and just essentially following orders, which is interesting when you get like somebody at the very top of government in a colonial society just following orders, which is kind of weird, because usually when you're at the top of the top, it's like usually you're at least exercising some, you're bringing your own ideas into the field, and that often doesn't happen in colonialism, in colonial power structures. But anyway, so there's this incredible bias towards the homeland, and there's a lot of violence and us versus them thought, and obsession with military strength because for colonizers it's viewed as necessary to maintain their status at the top, above the colonized population in the social hierarchy, but also in maintaining that hierarchy, but even just for establishing peace and having the colony be successful at all, they view violence and their own ethnic superiority as being essential for that. Incredibly conceited approach, of course, but that's often what's going on. Is they view it as necessary. They don't view it. They don't necessarily. Colonizers don't necessarily need to be racist to decide that racism is necessary. for political control, which is an interesting distinction to make. Still racist, but just like how that develops is important. Anyway, so essentially, I think that's what's going on in fascism. Because once we hit the industrial period, everything in society just speeds up. Things get more intense, like social processes, social order, things like that. Industrialized colonialism is way worse than in many ways than colonialism that preceded it. Industrialized slavery, way worse than the forms of slavery that preceded it. Not necessarily ideologically, because they're still, like, the predecessors were still totally noxious. But in terms of how fast, how harsh, how quickly things move in a post-industrial society or an industrialized society, things are just more intense and more harsh and more nasty. So that's so it's as industrialization kind of completes itself in the early 20th century, not 1900s. I always mix that up. As industrialization is kind of peaking in the 1900s, and it's the fixation of a lot of governments, including, of course, Germany, Italy, and Japan, then it's accelerating also colonial processes. And colonialism is also reaching its nadir because, like, World War II basically represents colonialism reaching its maximum pitch and then collapsing under its own weight. And that's why we see after World War II, most empires, pretty much every empire collapsing, mostly under its own weight. Because we can talk about how World War II applies pressure to empires, but that doesn't necessarily address the fact that, like, it is ultimately under their own weight and the inability to defend themselves or maintain coherent notions of identity. And that's why we get, for instance, even though the British Empire survived World War II, over the next decades, we get lots of voluntary surrenders of control, and in the British Empire allowing a lot of territories to break off of its own volition. At least partially of its own volition anyway. So yeah, basically what I think is happening with fascism is you take all these colonial processes that have been perfected and intensified over centuries, you mix that with industrialization, and then you apply it to the homeland. Because I think that actually explains the particular social orders that fascism promotes. Because the interesting thing is colonial government focuses on homeland government and is an imitator and fixates on homeland government and people of the homeland. So what happens when the homeland itself is now a colony and the homeland can't look to itself for a model, or just like mere residence in the homeland presents you with a special status? Basically, what you have to do at that point is retreat the notion of homeland even tighter and tighter to higher levels of the social hierarchy. Obviously, a lot of fascist groups did that by assigning homeland status to a specific ethnicity, but especially I think it assigns it to the top levels of government, and why it benefits, and fascism often focuses on having charismatic militaristic leaders, is because they provide for when the homeland is a colony, they provide a sense of homeland in that environment. They provide someone to look to model a model for the entirety of civilization. If you have a more democratic or dispersed power in the setting, you don't have anyone to look to. But when you have a single figure of government who is charismatic and appealing to the people, that provides a homeland concept, even when the homeland itself is fragmented or is no longer considered a safe source for colonial policy. But yeah, you basically have this one person who serves as the prototype of your civilization, and everyone looks to them. Because you can't do that if you have 20, like in the United States, 500 different Congress people. You don't use congressmen they can't serve that role of providing a model for society. But other things I think we see in fascist thought is the conversion of the homeland into a militaristic state, where there's a sense of constant threat by parts of the population that need to be managed through force. So the division of society along those lines, and like the increased military presence in civil society, like in the interior of the country, as opposed to the military being primarily existing against foreign threats, things like that. So yeah, that's militarization. That's us versus them. That's ethnic issues. That explains why we get genocides. And it explains where the nationalism comes from and why it's so intensely nationalist. It explains its connections with industrialization and colonialism. And yeah, it's, I think this theory works because this is genuinely what I think is happening is, people get hopped up on, colonial thought, colonial ideology and this notion of greatness and being the greatest and establishing greatness through violence. And fascism, I think, is the result of that. I think it also results a lot, but also promotes and fosters the emotion of insecurity in the homeland. I think fascism is an insecure ideology because it requires and encourages people to think of their neighbors as potential threats, and it refuses to establish a cogent national identity outside of an arbitrarily established group. It doesn't allow it. Fascism isn't able to contemplate a multifaceted or complex sense of nationality or a complex national narrative. It requires very, very reductive stuff. So hopefully that's enough for y'all to start thinking about it, because I can't hit everything or like all the implications. But yeah, basically, if you think about fascism as just a country eating itself, I think that's pretty dang accurate. And I think that is ultimately what it's happening. Just the sensation of you can no longer trust yourself, so you got to eat yourself. You got to regiment yourself. You got to put guns to your own people, put your own people to the sword, and attack. And you can't trust even your own government, the entirety of your own government, to provide what is quote unquote in your best interest as a people. You have to go to the tops of power, the very, very peaks of the like charismatic leadership, and only people who are ideologically identical are really safe, quote unquote. So yeah, one last thing I'd note on this is I think it also explains why fascist governments have a strong tendency for corruption and exploitation of their own people. Because that is, again, a colonial way of thinking. Colonialism was built on the ideology of mercantilism, which is you build a colony, you extract its wealth, and you transfer that wealth to the homeland. But again, if fascism is engaging in colonialism on its own homeland, mercantilism doesn't work in terms of transferring wealth from colonized to colonizer. Which isn't, so what you do is, since the homeland is itself now a colony, the homeland itself now needs to transfer its wealth somewhere else and make someone else rich. And that happens to be the fascist leaders in the fascist party to some degree, fascist partisans. But yeah, so that even explains why you get that transfer of wealth from even within the homeland to the tops of government, basically. Just another way to summarize this is that fascism makes the top of the government the homeland, and its partisans. Its partisans become the homeland, and everybody who is outside of the party, and especially who isn't at the top of the party or has like strongly established ties to the party, they are viewed as the colonized population. Something to be controlled, a constant threat, something that is trying to corrupt your morality, even though you're the one who is trying to subject them, ironically enough. So I think that's what's going on with fascism. Hopefully this has been interesting. Looks like we're coming in at about 25 minutes in total, which isn't too bad to try to understand fascism, considering all that's going on with them. But yeah, I think this is a pretty good way to understand why fascism arises when it does, why it exists at all, why people find it appealing, what kind of ideas place you at risk for fascist manipulation, namely colonial and industrialized ideas. Are probably the biggest ones that I think make people vulnerable to fascism. Not even necessarily heavily racialized ideas definitely are a big risk, but I think especially like colonial style ideas and industrial ideas are maybe even more of the source, or at least one of the big sources of fascist thought. And I think this model helps us understand also how things are changing, and why we don't necessarily see fascism per se, because colonialism has largely fallen out of favor. Industrialism hasn't, but colonialism has, just because it's pretty obviously unviable at this point. To most people can tell as much. Anyway, hopefully this has been helpful. Hopefully this helps y'all navigate your own lives and understand the world a little bit better. Because I think I'm right. I don't know. It's like I don't necessarily this theory doesn't necessarily cover everything about fascism, and there's still more that maybe there's still more worth studying. But I think this has been kind of the fruits of my labor in trying to understand what's cooking, what's going on here. So yeah, hopefully it's useful to y'all too. And if it isn't, don't worry. Just use whatever theory is most useful to y'all. That's always something important to remember with theories, is use whatever theory helps you most. And by help, I especially mean whichever you think is truest. Because the truth is always the most helpful, even if it's harder. But yeah, because a lot of fascist theories do struggle, I think, with not being adequately committed to a sense of truthfulness, just because they do engage in a lot of overreaching or underreaching even. I don't think underreaching has been as much of a problem, just because everyone loves to call everyone Nazis. Everyone who disagrees with you is a Nazi and all that jazz. That kind of mindset. But I've tried not to engage in that, and I think we can do better. So, and of course, combating fascism requires an actual understanding of fascism. So that's another big reason for this. So anyway, take care, stay safe. Sorry for taking up so much of y'all's time, but yeah, hope it's useful. This has been Desert Theorem. See y'all on the flip side.